Okay, at Adam's request, let's do a what makes a decent antagonist video. So I've made a very quick, short list of various different antagonists that have turned up throughout the game, and I'll talk a little bit about each one and what I think made them effective. Maybe you can weigh in as well and tell me what you think. Actually, before we get onto Stonefish, which was going to be my zero, I'll talk about Solomon. Solomon never had a character artwork, so he's not actually in the folder of artworks that I just put together. So Solomon was the sort of the principal antagonist of the first arc of the campaign when you guys were stuck on Thysis. So this was before Tim joined the game. And what made Solomon effective was there's going to be a common theme amongst all of these antagonists, with maybe the exception of one, which is that Solomon actually had a relationship with you guys, the players, or at least he kind of had an opinion on you. I think villains who don't really know who the heroes are aren't particularly interesting to engage with because there's nothing to play on, there's no chemistry. And I think that makes that fun. If you look at decent TV shows or decent movies, then there's usually some kind of relationship between the villain and the hero. So let's think of an example. Everybody's seen Infinity War. So first and foremost, the heroes have built up an impression of who Thanos is for quite a long time. And Thanos actually knows who a few of the heroes are. Quite a few of them, in fact. He knows who Tony Stark is, for example. He obviously has a relationship with Gamora. And then he has an opinion on Quill once he meets Quill. And so that chemistry creates something, a dialogue that means that the relationship between the villain and the hero is more than just fighting. And Solomon had an opinion on the heroes. He wanted to get rid of them, and then he met them and he was intrigued. And so he didn't initially kill Mihai when they had the opportunity to go one-on-one. But then one of the other things that made Solomon effective, and again, this is going to come up with a lot of these villains, is Solomon was willing to take something away from the players. Right, he was an actual threat, and I, as the DM, allowed him to take something away from you by destroying the temple that you guys had made friends at, and indeed killing Abandon. And I think villains have to actually present a reasonable threat, and the at least in a game of Dungeons and Dragons, the DM has to demonstrate that they are willing to threaten something that the players hold dear, and it might be the players themselves, or it might be something else that they care about. So yeah, I think Solomon was a pretty reasonable bad guy. He had an interesting power set that made him interesting to fight because he had gigantic fists, and a lot of his combat style was very close and personal, which I think makes him more interesting to fight because you actually get to fight him, if that makes sense, and that's not going to be the case with all the villains on this list. So that's Solomon. Let's talk about Stonefish, another character who hasn't really turned up since Arc 1, so again, Tim isn't going to really know that much about Stonefish. Stonefish was a Gorgon spy who had a Asclepios circlet, so she can transform her appearance to look like a more ordinary person, like the picture that you can see on the screen. And her snake hair is disguised as, I think, 7 or 8 braids. Stonefish was an interesting villain, I think, because she was willing to do terrible things, but she had her own reasons for doing them that made a lot of sense. And I'm not sure, I can't really remember how much of Stonefish's story really came out. But effectively, she was looking for Ariel Strabor, who was the illegitimate daughter of the Grand Wizard Mordenkainen, because she had made a bargain to basically kidnap Ariel and then sell her to somebody who was willing to pay a lot of money for her. And Stonefish's lack of morals and desire for very specific things that aren't necessarily bad, like money and renown, made her an effective villain, but not necessarily one that needed to be killed. She could actually be reasoned with, and so I think, in terms of the story, she occupies a position of sort of as a sort of a anti-villain, somebody who is a villain in many ways, but can also be used as an asset if you're able to incentivize her in the right way. And I think maybe one of the important things with a villain is coming up with a sort of an original concept. One of the easy ways to come up with an original concept is to mix two things together that are relatively well known, but the combination of them makes something that's new and original. So what happens if you take a Gorgon and give them the ability to disguise themselves? So now you have a Gorgon who can actually interact with people in an ordinary way and build up relationships. And all of the other things about Stonefish really came out of that idea, where she was a functioning member of society, despite the fact that she was a Gorgon. And had a role and could interact with other people, and from that is able to have more human motivations that come out of interacting with other people. So Stonefish was a lot of fun to play. And I think you guys probably recognise that when I got to portray her. Let's take a look at the next person on our list. So Faradi, I think, considering that Faradi was actually in the game from episode 1, he remained a sort of a caricature of a sort of a mustache twirling Disney villain, and was still a reasonably realistic depiction of a real person, but very much that sort of trope of a person who is born into privilege and wealth and then squanders it to pursue further villainy and wealth, or further privilege and wealth. And a lot of Faradi's motivations were built around the idea of being the younger sibling to an older sibling who outclassed them in pretty much every way. And so a lot of his actions were based on insecurity, because he was trying to prove that he could be as successful as his significantly older brother, who had already made a name for himself by the time Faradi became an adult. And so in trying to replicate his older brother, who was more intelligent than he was and a lot more subtle, Faradi was a fairly obvious, I don't know, it was fairly obvious in its villainy. And to have a person who is intrinsically very flawed. I think flaws certainly make a villain very interesting. So to go back to our previous example, in fact, maybe even both the previous examples, Solmon's flaws were, he was quite prideful in a way that he was looking to prove himself as well. But also, while he was brighter than your average hobgoblin, he wasn't so intelligent that he couldn't be exploited. Stonefish's weaknesses actually probably didn't all come up in the course of the game. Stonefish's weaknesses are, first and foremost, she's actually an alcoholic, although that probably wasn't particularly obvious. She pretty much always had a glass of wine in her hand, and that was largely due to trying to deal with the reality of who she was as a person and a lack of being accepted when she was much younger. And so those were probably her two main character flaws. Faradi's character flaws are a little bit more obvious, in that he is like a gross over-exaggeration of what it is to be insecure, and the other main weakness that he has is as an individual, he's not particularly powerful. Like, he is not particularly threatening as a person because he is a guy. He's just a guy with a lot of money, so he could pay a lot of other people to help him. And I think probably one of the things that made Faradi more interesting as a villain was the fact that he had other people working with him. And not all of those people were necessarily bad, but they were willing to do what he asked in order to get paid. So a couple of those other people are on the list. But for example, I think Faradi was probably made more interesting by a character like Mytos, where if Faradi can hire people who are actually good, then suddenly the heroes have to do a bit more thinking when it comes to dealing with Faradi, because now he has people protecting him who you don't want to kill. And I think go and kill this random guy who's obviously really bad but actually can't defend himself. So yeah, I think that made Faradi a more interesting villain. I think his demise was well earned. Let's talk briefly about Walrus. I think Walrus might be a character that probably most people don't consider to be that villainous, which is interesting considering what he did. Like, he was responsible for the destruction of the Radiance Bunker pretty much directly. Like, he was one of the two hands that wielded that weapon that destroyed the Radiance Bunker. And I thought it was really interesting when you decided to let him go. Kind of a weird character in that he was an underdog. or was framed as an underdog in the story. In terms of, he worked for somebody who he didn't agree should be a leader, and so he turned to somebody else to give him an advantage. And so even in that situation, he was still the underdog. He was still working for somebody else, but was motivated to create a better life for himself and for some other people. But that just involved doing some really terrible things. Walrus is obviously still around. So who knows? Maybe he'll pop up again in the story. He's still close by, so that's quite likely. But yeah, I think in terms of what made Walrus an effective villain was probably that he had very realistic motivations, and I think that came across. So you guys actually understood, hold on, maybe this isn't someone who's actually evil. He's just somebody who is like doing bad things for actually fairly good reasons. The other thing that I think made him an interesting villain was that he was very flawed. But in a way that wasn't necessarily his fault, because as the picture shows, he has a giant metal spike through his head. So Walrus suffered pretty serious brain damage that led to memory loss on a fairly regular basis. And so that flaw, I think, makes him more interesting, and is possibly also something that isn't necessarily something that can be exploited particularly easily, but just kind of humanizes him. So yeah. Next character, Nine Lives. Again, a slightly more cartoonish villain, in that Nine Lives is much further along the spectrum of... there are characters who are evil for good reason, then there are characters like Nine Lives who are just kind of a dick, and Nine Lives is very much that. So he's a little bit closer to Ferrari on that kind of scale. Nine Lives is somebody who will do basically anything if it gives him some advantage in life. So, for example, the way that he acquired the arm wraps that give him a fairly decent amount of his power and his threat, a lot of it comes from those arm wraps. The way that he acquired those involved the deaths of a large number of people, which he has no remorse over. And the fact that in order to use the arm wraps, again, costs somebody else their life in a pretty horrific way, has no impact on him. Emotionally. And whether or not that is a byproduct of the arm wraps themselves remains to be seen. You guys will have to investigate that a little bit further. But yeah, Nine Lives is a pretty terrible person, I think. One of the things that makes Nine Lives interesting is that killing him is not a reasonable solution to the threat that he presents, because he comes back to life. Which... when you're a DM, it can be very difficult to create villains that have long-lasting impact, because a lot of the time the players will just fight them and kill them, and that's the end of the story. And I think with a lot of the villains on this list, they presented threats that couldn't necessarily be killed as an easy solution. Ferrari definitely could be killed, and that was a fairly decent solution to him. Although the other part of that problem was that Ferrari had allies who would have been able to resurrect him if they were given the opportunity. Nine Lives can't just be killed as a solution to that problem, and so he presents an interesting recurring threat that requires a more tactful solution, so shall we say. Maggie is the next person on the list. What makes Maggie a good villain? I think the way that you guys behave towards Maggie probably says more about her than I could ever really have anticipated. Probably one of the things that made Maggie a more interesting villain from the outset was the fact that she was also very much presented as an underdog from the outset. So when you met her, obviously she spent the first 12 sessions after you met her in a jail cell, with no access to any of the things that made her powerful. And I think the way that you introduce a character has a big impact on the way that people see them. And so that first introduction is a very powerful thing. For example, Jessica's introduction involved her beating up somebody who was much larger than her. And I think that had an impact on the way that people saw Jessica. And that's been true for quite a few of the characters in the game. I always prioritize the way that a character is introduced when trying to get across who that person is. And so Maggie was first introduced as a person who was in jail, and she had no power. And I think another thing that makes Maggie interesting is that she exhibits qualities that are aspirational and noble. And I doubt anybody's ever thought about that in regards to Maggie, but is definitely true because what does Maggie care about? She cares about her family, her brother. She cares about her country and the people around her in the place where she's from. And she self-internalizes. So she thinks about things, and that, I think, comes across. She reflects on what she's done and the situation that she finds herself in, and that comes across through conversation. And I think that makes Maggie much more interesting as an antagonist, because she is not a black and white villain. She is a person who has done terrible things to people that you guys, the heroes, care about. But she's doing it out of motivations that are intrinsically human and relatable. And I think that certainly made her much more interesting. Maggie also has quite a sympathetic sort of backstory where she is disempowered within her society, despite the fact that she possesses great skill, as it were. And I think that makes her quite sympathetic as a character. And again, because she is not a black and white villain, there is a lot more leeway with how the players are able to, how you guys are able to interact with her and turn her into something other than just an enemy. And I think that makes her interesting. And again, I talked about this with Solomon, and maybe I should talk about this a little bit more in regards to each character. All of the characters that we've seen so far have a relationship with the heroes and have an opinion on them, and in particular have different opinions about different members of the group. Okay, so somebody like Stonefish, her initial interaction with Yasan was interesting, but she had the opportunity to basically kill Yasan and didn't, right? Because it's not her go-to, if that makes sense. Like, even though she is a spy, killing somebody isn't necessarily her go-to, and she has opinions on people within the group. Faradi also had relationships with members of the party in various different ways. Like, for example, he put a hit on Timur, right? One of the things I haven't actually talked about yet, which was one of the main points I wanted to touch on, was that great villains attack the heroes. They don't just wait for you to come to them. It's not, they are not Bowser waiting in a castle for you to turn up and try and save Princess Peach. Faradi put a hit on Timur in episode 19 or 20 after he realized that Timur had survived the shipwreck. And coming after the players in that way, I think, is what turns a villain from a obstacle into a threat, which is a big difference. So Faradi had opinions on members of the group. Walrus also has opinions on the members of the group, although not as directly, more as a sort of a, oh, you're an associate of Jessica kind of way. But Walrus's opinions on Jessica were not explicitly, he didn't hate her. He just thought that she wasn't the right person for the job. And so those feelings kind of carried over to the party as they associated with Jessica in a sort of, you're against me, but you're not my enemy kind of way. And Nine Lives kind of has opinions on the group, but mostly they are inherited through the people that he associates with. So being paid by Faradi to do certain things to members of the group is not a direct, his actions are not a direct result of his feelings towards them, although he does now. He is beginning to have opinions about members of the group because you've killed him 3 times. So changes the equation a little bit as far as he's concerned. So he does now have more personal opinions about the party. He's been killed by Toasty once, possibly twice, and he got killed underneath the Radiance bunker as well, which I can't remember who was directly responsible for that. Maybe you guys can remind me who actually got the killing blow on him. It might have been Iroh or Timur, I'm not sure. Maggie obviously has massive opinions on the group and different members within it. The most obvious person being Bedina, obviously, and Maggie's relationship with Bedina changed significantly during the solo game, which is a shame we didn't record it, because the moment where Maggie realised who Bedina could be, basically, or who Bedina could be to her and to the rest of the Fens, was a big turning point in Maggie's relationship to Bedina. Because up until that point, Maggie had thought that Bedina was basically a traitor to the Fens because she was conspiring with the Oikoans. But then when Bedina protected Maggie from Dimitri and then killed Dimitri, Maggie realised that Bedina was a lot more complex than that, and that Bedina could actually be a significant player in the Fens' survival, basically. And then obviously she also has particular opinions on other members of the group depending on her interactions with them, like her interaction with Yasan, where Yasan basically refused to help her when given the opportunity, and so she has a particular attitude towards Yasan, and similarly towards Timur, where Maggie and Timur actually had this kind of moment when Maggie was still in jail and Timur was when the Timur duplicate turned up, and Timur locked himself in the jail with Maggie, and so there was actually a period of time that they spent together, and as a result Maggie has very almost a mixed opinion on Timur because she can't really figure him out, but also I think Maggie finds quite unsettling the fact that Timur doesn't act on emotion, and actually most of the Fens do. Most of the Fens act based on emotion, not based on logic, and so she has no way to kind of figure out who Timur is, and so I think she finds that a little bit unsettling. And obviously Maggie's relationship with Mihai is so complicated, because her initial way of reacting to someone like Mihai is like, he is obviously my enemy. She obviously considers Mihai to be just her enemy of enemies, but to then begin to see him in a different light as a result of going through combat scenarios with him, and also the fact that he effectively gave her a chance when she had put herself in a situation where she would never have expected that from an enemy. I think that relationship has begun to change a little bit, and I'm interested to see where that goes in the future. That's quite an in-depth discussion about who Maggie is. One of the other things that makes Maggie a difficult character now to include in the story is that Maggie is quite powerful, and so for you to have, if you having a blood witch running around with you who is as powerful as Maggie is, makes certain challenges a lot trickier to implement, because Maggie can just solve them, like the fact that she can fly, and for a short period of time can take somebody else with her in her flight form and can cast polymorph and things. I'm a little bit wary about Maggie solving all problems, and so Maggie leaving the party for the current story arc was a deliberate decision, because I wanted there to be things that would threaten you that Maggie would otherwise be able to solve far too easily. But Maggie's temporary departure also allows me to set up the next part of the plot when it comes to the Fens. So we'll get to that when we get to it. The other problem with having Maggie around is that as the DM, I have to make sure that Maggie is reacting to things in a realistic manner. And so when you guys meet other NPCs, then Maggie has to have a reaction to that, and that makes it makes my brain explode. So I have to be very careful with NPCs following you around too much, especially if there becomes a point where there are too many NPCs who are following you around as your entourage. So much like in a regular TV show, you can't have 15 named characters in every episode all running around together, because it would just get far too complicated to have all of them reacting to things and figuring out who is the main focus in any given scene. So there you go. There's a deep dive on one of the more complicated characters in the game. Finally, we get to Luther Botomi himself, who kind of sparked this entire video to begin with. What makes Botomi a good antagonist? was said about, I think I talked about Thanos before. One of the things that Joe Russo, who was one of the directors of Infinity War, one of the things that Joe Russo said about Thanos is the challenge of creating Thanos was to create a villain like Darth Vader, but who was 10 times worse than Darth Vader. And in order to do that, you have to have a villain who's willing to do terrible things. And the other villains on the list so far, I mean, were willing to do terrible things to an extent, and some of those things were very personal, like killing off people that the characters you guys cared about, like killing Abandon or killing the members of the Radiance Bunker, or kidnapping Ariel. Botomi has that, obviously, through his relationship to Benthic and what he did to Benthic. But Botomi's style of villainy is kind of on another level, because it is something where your initial reaction to it is the idea of like brainwashing another person and effectively just erasing everything about who they are and turning them into a pawn under your control. That style of villainy, it kind of hits you in the kind of, oh, that's really bad. But when you really start to think about it, you're like, is that worse than killing somebody? Maybe. But on top of that, you just get the whole idea that wiping out who somebody is and then turning them into your pawn is it presents so many complexities within the game that make Botomi a much more interesting villain, because I guess we can talk about the Hollow Man in conjunction with Botomi. Attacking and killing Botomi is not as simple as just running at him and trying to wipe him out, because of a character like the Hollow Man, because of Benthic, where if Benthic can be saved, or the idea that Benthic can be saved and go back to being who he was before, presents an extra dimension to the problem. And that's further compounded by the idea that the Hollow Man is both a weapon that Botomi can wield, but he is also a bargaining chip and a hostage. And that's a weird and unusual situation, because like villains taking hostages is a pretty old, tried and tested formula, and villains having henchmen is a pretty old and tried and tested formula. But the idea that the villain's henchman is a hostage, and it's a hostage that you care about, is pretty wild, pretty interesting, and I think it makes Botomi a lot more complex than just an evil wizard. Going back to the idea of villains having flaws, Botomi does have flaws, and those flaws are what actually drive him to collaborate with other people. So we've kind of seen Botomi acting in conjunction with other people because Botomi needs what other people have. So he needs other people's money, for example. And I think the idea of like villains collaborating certainly makes them more interesting, in the same way that Stonefish was a character created by combining the idea of a Gorgon with a hat of disguise, right? Something that allows her to disguise herself. Having villains that join together and work together creates something much more interesting, because now instead of one thing that's predictable, you've got two people, and therefore they can both be unpredictable. Botomi collaborating with people like Nine Lives, and tangentially with Walrus and with Faradi and with Benthic, makes him much more interesting. And much like the previous villains, Botomi has a lot of opinions about members of the group, has a different opinion about different members of the group, has demonstrated that he is willing to go after them specifically, both with his targeting of Timur in episode 21, or whatever it was, where Timur got kind of kidnapped and could have been killed. But also when he targeted the targeting the Radiance bunker, which he was involved in that he helped to provide the explosives, and also with the stealing the fragment of the sun, which was very much his idea. That is a very personal attack on the players, and that makes him a more interesting villain, because he is attacking them specifically and is taking things away from them specifically. And I guess also turning Benthic into the Hollow Man as well is a personal attack on the players, right? And that makes him a much more effective antagonist because it is personal. Yeah. I feel like this artwork really sells the character so well. This artwork's actually from The Witcher, as is quite a lot of the artwork that I use. And I think possibly Botomi didn't really have that much of a personality until I found this piece of artwork. And I saw it and I thought, oh, I know who that guy is. Yeah, I can play that character. And I think a lot of him came out of this particular piece of artwork. I think one of the good ways to make a villain effective when it comes to making players hate them is making it so that they have things that counter the strengths of the players, and in particular in a way that frustrates them. So Botomi's kind of big trick is greater invisibility. And I know that you guys as players found fighting him to be incredibly frustrating, because you just seem to have the upper hand a lot of the time, largely because of that spell. And I think heroes having ways to kind of confound the players makes them much more effective, because if players are getting frustrated at combat mechanics, then that transfers onto the villain and they hate the villain. So I think that worked pretty well. I think there's anything more to say about the Hollow Man? Not particularly. The Hollow Man is interesting because of who he is in reality and the fact that you guys can't just kill him. Or you can, but like it isn't a decent solution to the problem because of who he is. Because he's an unwilling accomplice to the villain, and he's somebody that the players actually care about, or at least one of the players does. So yeah. The final villain I wanted to talk about was obviously the newest one to the game, which is the Dread. And this is a completely different type of villain, where every other person on this list is a person with person motivations, and this is really the first time where I've introduced a villain that is a monster. And there have been other monsters in the game, like Axamama, who was a spectator, a beholder, basically. And like the Troll, which is obviously another monster, but like this is the first time where you fought something that is a significant threat to either you guys or somebody else that you care about. And at this point, it's probably too early to say, but I feel like the Dread are effective because they are just bizarre and terrifying. And the thing about every other person on this list is that they can, with probably the exception of the Hollow Man, every other person on this list could be reasoned with. Right, you could find common ground with them, or you could find some way to bargain with them if you were in a situation where they had the upper hand. That's not necessarily the case with the Dread, because they just are not motivated by human things. The Dread are very much driven by primal instinct, and while they are more intelligent than beasts, they are driven by almost base instinct. Because they aren't of this world, and they're basically a manifestation of an emotion. They are living fear. And what does that actually mean? So the Dread are probably less interesting than the other villains conceptually, but they are probably scarier, I think. And I mean, this artwork really works as an effective piece to tell a story with, I think. And when I found this piece of artwork, it inspired a lot of creative thinking when it came to the monster design and creating that as a villainous entity. I feel like I kind of want your opinions more on the Dread, and at the moment more than I want to give an opinion on them, because there's still quite a lot that you don't know, and I want to know your thoughts and feeling on them, and what do you think about them as an addition to the game. Yeah. Do I want to say anything else about villains? I don't think so. I might talk a little bit more about the Conscriptor, who's only just turned up. and maybe I'll make a second video about the conscriptor for after this week's game. So yeah, that video was only half an hour long, so good job me. Concise, really good job, really cut down on work there. Cool.